Welcome back, everybody, to our continuing look at Dr. Orasami Burton's Tip of the Spear. This is now Chapter 4. Chapter 4, titled Gender War, Sexual Revenge, and White Masculine Repair. This is a very difficult chapter to deal with, admittedly, and I applaud all of you for struggling with it as I continue to do. This rereading of it doesn't make it any easier. But as Dr. Burton says, it's important that we engage this because in part because it's an as he says, under theorized aspect of not only the Attica uprising, prisons in general, but how, at least as I understand what he's saying, how societal pressures, settler colonialism, white supremacy, the concept of white man, all work to impose on all of us variations of self-concept, identity, gender, sexuality, and beyond. So as Burton says, the chapter is a focus on sexual revenge and a defense of normative sexuality. Again, so as I understand it, this idea that what we conceive of as normative or normal or standard, so to speak, is itself a social construct and can be manipulated. And in the context of a settler colony, is manipulated in defense of what Burton describes as white man. That is, this broader idea of what manhood and personhood and race mean in a white supremacist, capitalist, settler colonial environment such as this. In dialogue with existing conversations exploring how normative conceptions of gender and race are constructed through anti-Black violence, this chapter describes a range of terroristic practices that are likely to be agonizingly familiar because of their centrality to the maintenance of white power across historical regimes. It shows that a Black masculine insurgency, the Long Attica Revolt, hurled the figure of white man into crisis and divested it of a core pillar, the politically, culturally, and sexually subordinated Black male. So again, I just encourage you all to continue to study and to review what Burton likely introduces some of you to, and what he returns to the rest of us as a focus, and go beyond what I'm going to be able to do in this class and this limited exchange to really make this chapter and really the whole book as meaningful and substantive as it really is. As is often the case with this book, and why I wanted to use it and why I wanted to challenge you all to use it and engage it, is that it is intellectually challenging. It is culturally, politically, it is a broad challenge and an important one. I keep coming back to, there's this core basic principle in media studies that argues that we define ourselves as much by what we are not by what we are. So in a white supremacist society, it's never enough for white people to just say Black people are inferior. There needs to be an attempt to demonstrate that over and over and over again. In a patriarchal society, men can't just say men are superior to women. They have to reaffirm that over and over and over again through media, depiction, language, hiring, payment, all of that goes into it, but all of it is to reaffirm the inferiority of the other to justify the sense of superiority of the self. And this chapter is rife with that basic concept. White manhood can't exist unless Black manhood is suppressed, subjugated, destroyed. White manhood is connected to a concept of all personhood and humanity. So this is where you get the sort of abusive construction of gender roles and sexual behavior, and where, as Burton calls it, a sexual revenge is meant to reaffirm for the white man a sense of superiority by destroying a sense of manhood, sexuality, power, sovereignty over one's body in those racialized as Black. And as Burton talks about, this goes beyond those with actual literal melanated skin. Everyone becomes, as he talks about in the chapter, niggerized if they stand up against the state. And again, for me, I want to bring some attention back to how much in this chapter is done to talk about beyond the physical, the manipulation of consciousness, self-concept, the importance of narratives and symbols and semiotics, which is simply, as we'll come back to briefly, the study of how symbols communicate ideas. Burton says on page 122, I construct my argument by thinking and theorizing with criminalized black rebels, both living and dead. What they have to say upends the popular notion that ongoing refusal of the state to divulge its secrets are what prevent us from fully understanding Attica. And just to back up, and again, what Burton is saying here is that the sexual violence or the sexual revenge is part of the counterinsurgency tactic to suppress black radicalism. And that's why, to the point where I was just reading on page 122, where it's important that Burton center methodologically those who suffered this abuse as the primary sources for what happened, instead of just taking state-sponsored, and as he's very right to condemn in here, the liberal reshaping of the narrative by academics and journalists. And again, one of the reasons this chapter, maybe as much as any, demonstrates why this book to me is as much a revelation as a study of communication and media studies as it is about prisons or any other field for that matter. And there are many fields that this book brilliantly addresses itself to. But part of what I think it's important to understand, especially about media and all forms of communication, is that there is a relationship between what is communicated, how it's communicated, the frame, the narrative, and political power. There is an intimate relationship, so that there is no, that again, why what we think of as entertainment, what we think of as social media, what we think of as more or less innocuous entertainment or media or books or whatever are very much related to the maintenance of power through the transmission of ideas, the conveyance of certain attitudes and frames of reference, and even symbols of power. So on page 123, I think this is a very powerful way of making the point that I'm trying to make, and one that is difficult to deal with, admittedly. But on page 123, Burton talks about the so-called nigger stick, the police baton that is, of course, used to and labeled as an abusive weapon against those racialized and rebranded as hard R niggers, okay? But he talks about it as a medium of communication, and a medium, again, similar to the word, a cognate of the word media. Medium is a singular as the singular form of media, the plural, which are just mechanisms or technology or the means by which ideas are transmitted or communicated. So the so-called nigger stick becomes a mechanism, as he says here, a medium of communication. The nigger stick demarcated the boundaries between white masculine humanity and ungendered black nothingness, between those who were men and those who were not. Capitalist social relations are entangled with these racial gender dynamics. That is, the social relationships of how labor is exploited and how resources are exploited and wealth and profit is extracted ever into the hands of a tinier and tinier few who rule. All of that involves a process that is physically violent, psychologically violent, and in this case involves the complete subjugation or destruction of self-concept, of humanhood, of personhood, where this violent baton becomes, as Burton talks about, a phallic symbol. It's used phallically. It's used to beat and to rape and molest and to conquer psychologically those who might become rebellious, those who might have their self-concept of personhood, of manhood, lead them into rebellion against the state, against those who rule. So I just thought that this is an important point, that the prison itself, the baton, the handcuffs, the jails, the bars, the walls. These are all not just physical structures, but they are communicating something. They are media. They are in the singular a medium communicating white manhood, the justification of settler colonial rule, the inhumanity of blackness and black people. So much of this chapter is talking about symbols and media and communicating through photographs, through moving images, through memory. Black pain and suffering, which is meant to produce the opposite for those who rule, that is, produce a sense of superiority and justification. Burton, importantly, given the world in which we live now, and I wish we had more time to talk more about all of this, but he makes a very important point on page 124 about political masculinity, that this isn't some alpha male, testosterone-laden, manosphere, red pill, whatever nonsense we see on YouTube and elsewhere in today's world. These prisoners self-defining as men was meant, they're, as he says, encapsulated by their statement, "We are men, we are not beasts, and do not intend to be beaten or driven as such." The Attica rebels asserted a political masculinity, and in so doing repudiated these genocidal logics and bestial dehumanizations. Critical interventions by black feminist scholars have subjected masculinist formulations such as this to analytical pressure, showing how the dynamism of potentially transformative movements is hampered by patriarchy, and how women and gender nonconforming people were forced to struggle against these logics both in the broader world and in their own movements. The Attica revolt was not untarnished by patriarchy, sexism, and homophobia. Not only do phallocentric, sexist, and homophobic discourses litter the archive and rebels left behind, but many of them had committed acts of gender violence against each other and those in their communities, and it is critical that this dynamic be named and condemned for the harm that it caused. However, I'm adding that word, at the same time, their declaration of manhood is more complex than it may initially appear. When viewed through this frame, it becomes clear that as a totality, the revolt, that is the Long Attica revolt, was not an attempt to appropriate the trappings of white patriarchal power to attain parity with white man, or to become man, at the expense of others' autonomy and dignity. It was an effort to chart a new course for what a revolutionary manhood or humanhood, or as one survivor termed it, could become. So when you hear this reference to men and manhood, they're not trying to mimic what has been turned into something diabolical today. They're challenging those structures and what it means to be a man and have personhood. And to the point I was just making a moment ago, the sexual violence and sexual revenge taken on in this chapter and taken up at the end of the day by white man, as Burton describes it. One side won on page 125 by making the other side lose. The winner accumulated masculinity as a finite and privatized resource, while the loser was literally and figuratively unmanned. So that's why when the prisoners took over and there was the claim that they had physically violated and sexually violated the guards, that was later proven false, this was done because this is part of the concept that would be deployed by the guards, by the state, and has been done historically to those colonized as a mechanism of suppression and violence and conquering. So the fears, as I understand what Burton said, in other words, it's always that I've been doing it to you so long, so I know as soon as you get power, you're going to do it to me, even when those who were taking power through the revolt were not looking to replicate that and were proven not to have replicated that kind of violence. It was said that they did as a way to justify the previous behavior enacted by the guards against the prisoners, and then to later justify the wild abuse of the prisoners and the so-called militants after the revolt was put down. But the point still being that I was trying to point out earlier, this idea that I have to destroy you to build myself up. I can't be a man unless I destroy the concept of man as it relates to you. For our purposes and the sake of our own ability to recover from the chapter, and at the risk of doing it a further disservice, I'm going to avoid a lot of this discussion of the details of the violence. except only to point out, as Burton does, that the context of the sexual violence, particularly that suffered by the prisoners, was, as he said, part of the counterinsurgency. It was part of the mechanism of suppressing black radicalism. And there is at least room to consider the parallel as it happens outside of prisons. What does it mean in terms of how black manhood and maleness and men and manhood are defined outside of prison? And to what extent does that relate, or to what extent is it used to justify the ongoing oppression of black communities? Very quickly, on page 128, he talks about something that is Burton that I think is very important just to at least make note of, that the violence of lynching, the violence of prisons as a mass lynching, is not only meant to inflict pain, obviously, on the people suffering the immediate physical violence, but it's meant as a mechanism of terror against the rest of the community. When one person was lynched, it was meant as a symbol of what could and might happen to the rest if they go out of line. And that's what prisons are meant to represent as well. And the violence that prisoners are meant to are made to suffer, and how we're made to justify and accept that suffering under the pretense that they've committed a crime and somehow deserve it. All of that is done to keep us in line. But I'm going to spend the last few minutes I have with you talking about this chapter, talking about an aspect that I've been mentioning throughout and with this chapter as well, that again I think speaks to why this book is so brilliant as a media studies book, as a book that talks about the importance of media and communication as mechanisms of power, and gets us out of this mind state that media are just somehow garnish in our environment. You know, the dressing, the what dresses up our environment, that they're meant to entertain and inform and just kind of be there. No, they are weaponry. And Burton, I think, does a great job of highlighting that and appropriately showing the context. So in this section, a beautiful operation, as it was described, who said that? Was it the Rockefellers? One of the Rockefellers, one of the state administrators. Nelson Rockefeller called it a really beautiful operation when they talked about as Burton writes, the spectacle of Black death and mutilation of Black bodies and militants in particular. What I think Burton does here is so amazing. So for instance, on page 132, having analyzed the sexualized practices of the massacre as lynching, I now turn to the photographic and representational practices deployed to memorialize and communicate its white supremacist aesthetic to broader audiences. And I do want to show you a couple of things in the process here. So on 133, as Burton writes, as a semiotic vehicle in the pre-internet era, and he's talking about the cover of the official report of the New York State Special Commission on Attica. So Burton is talking about this book cover, the official report of the New York State Special Commission on Attica, published by Bantam Books. And on page 133, he writes, as a semiotic vehicle, that is, as a vehicle carrying messages of power through symbol. In the pre-internet era, the cover of the book conveyed a white masculine supremacy and black non-being. The cover of the book conveyed white masculine supremacy and black non-being as common sense, and did so under the insidious guise of an objective white liberal humanism. Clearly shaped by the visual imagery of white supremacy in which white man exists over and above his primitive wards, the tableau provided publics beyond the walls with a titillating glimpse of the spoils of domestic war. It invited them to identify not with the denuded, disgraced, and niggerized figures in the coffle, but with the generic stand-in for legitimized white state power, authority, and domination, the uniformed man with the big stick in the center of the frame. And you can see him there in the orange coat that Burton describes, with his quote-unquote nigger stick, standing there around all of those bodies, and who, again, as Burton talks about, not everybody is quote-unquote black in terms of racial category outside of the prison, but they have all been racialized as black because of their collective, unified, solidarist effort against the prison, and therefore they were all going to be abused similarly. The massacre was under intense visual surveillance. The FBI reportedly obtained 583 black and white photographs, 464 35mm color slides, 331 color photographs, and 6 videotapes. captured during the massacre and its aftermath. And he describes it as Burton describes them as semiotic stabilizers of white supremacy, which, by the way, is how I would argue we need to understand all mainstream commercial media. They're here to stabilize white civilization. And then look at how Burton talks about the relationship between the camera and the gun. Before initiating the slaughter, the documentarians were instructed to capture situations of opportunity. In other words, the men with cameras were afforded the same latitude and creative license as the men with guns. And I just want to show you this graphic here from a discussion about the Cuban Revolution and their use of media during the revolution, just because I think it just speaks to so much of what Burton is talking about here and how revolutionaries in a certain political context have understood media making. So you see here, it says, from Tour to Third Cinema by Octavio Gattino and Fernando Solanos. The camera is the inexhaustible expropriator of image weapons. The projector, a gun that can shoot 24 frames per second. And as I've always interpreted it, it's acknowledging the relationship of power and media. The camera can expropriate, can capture as much of what the camera holder wants, and then it can fire it back. After editing and manipulation, it can be fired. What is captured in the camera can be fired back to a population. That's why what Burton is talking about in here, throughout this chapter, actually, he's talking about how media, the photographs, the video, the narrative were used and are used to collect what is happening, edit it, manipulate it in a certain way, and project it, fire it back out as a weapon to semiotically stabilize white civilization. So all the propaganda you watch, all the films and television about police and the military in particular, but everything in popular commercial media needs to be understood in this way. Their efforts to stabilize white civilization. And similarly, I want to show you something from a conversation that I had a little while ago with, in this situation, Alexandra Kitty, who's an author and a journalist who's written a lot about, in this context, war propaganda. And I want you to listen to what she says about this experiment regarding the power of photographs, especially in the context of the 583 black and white photographs that the state collected and put to use, as Burton talks about, in a variety of ways in support of the state's behavior regarding Attica and the state's maintenance and management of the narrative of prisons more broadly. In your book, I wanted you to say something about, you talk a little bit about a study, I think in 2005, and the impact of photographs on implanted memories. And I was just wondering if you could just say a word or two about that, because I thought it was fascinating, the ability to manipulate what people think they know about their own past.
It was a very fascinating study. So they got university students, and they asked the researchers asked the parents for a photograph of the children, and they doctored the photograph, and they gave them 45 words, and they said, well, do you remember flying in a hot air balloon? And in 45 words in a picture, the subjects falsely remembered that they had been in a hot air balloon. And this study has been replicated in other things. So 45 words and a doctored picture is enough to alter your memory. It's enough to change your perceptions of reality. And and when you have that, your memory is not a tape recorder. It can be easily manipulated. And when you're afraid, what propaganda does, that hits your prefrontal cortex. First thing that happens is you lose your memory, your ability to remember. So you can be manipulated that way. And you got to remember, those subjects were not under stress. So add stress to that factor. You have no idea what you see.
So obviously you add the enormous stress of prison and prison rebellion, and you can see how 45 words and a doctored image could implant in full memories into the subject's mind. So imagine, what was it, 583 photographs with hundreds of video images is, what do you say? 583 black and white photographs, 464 35 millimeter color slides, 331 color photographs, and 6 videotapes. In addition to the physical violence, the supportive state structures and apparatus in terms of other media, journalism, and in terms of today's world, all the enhanced propaganda that we get in media and film, in the ability to manipulate and implant a memory, in a collective memory in throughout the entire society about Attica and what prisons are here to do, what they're meant to represent. We're, for instance, always meant to remember they're here to protect us from them. They're here as punishment for those who deserve to be there. But as Burton has been showing us, there's so much more going on here, and it's much more about the maintenance of an unequal society and a punishment for those, particularly black people, who would rebel against this society in the most radical militant forms. So that's why Burton talks so much about the terror and enjoyment expressed by the guards and suffered by the prisoners. The transfer of this to Abu Ghraib during the second part of the Iraq, or the more recent Iraq invasion in 2003, that many of you wouldn't even know about or remember. But the same things were done in that situation. I just watched Surviving Ohio State, the new documentary on Netflix. A very similar situation in the context of a university, and with an almost exclusively white male clientele or base or group. And yet you still see a lot of the same kinds of tendencies happening in that context. And this is why I've talked about it elsewhere and repeatedly, but on page 135, where Burton writes, through photography, David Marriott explains, an image of white identity emerges from a spectacle of annihilation, the lynchers posing grimly alongside their black trophies. A moment frozen in time, flashlit in the heat of subsided passion. This is why I don't like museums. That's how I see all museums in this country. Maybe with few exceptions, but even where one of you asked me about the Blacks and Wax Museum in Baltimore, even that is still in the same context of black suffering, trauma, and abuse, with very conservative and limited notions of black rebellion and uprise, by the way, to balance that out. So it's still an experience of trauma that does much of what this society once done. To use that trauma as to give trophy and commemoration to white settler colonialism and anti-black violence, and specifically anti-black radical violence. And as Burton writes, again, this is what I'm saying about the how we need to understand media and why this book is so good in that context as well. On 136, the way the prisoners were paraded and abused, not only physically in the space, but throughout time and space via image, photograph, video, and memory. The lens, the gun, and the nigger stick was simultaneously an instrument of violence and a tool of sexualized play. The wielders of these weapons were not only securing the prison and producing evidence for their official state functions, they were producing home movies intended for circulation and consumption within the sacred spaces of white sociality. And this is why you get reference to this important, underappreciated, and lesser discussed story from James Baldwin, Going to Meet the Man, which again talks about the lynching from the perspective of a lynch, of the man committing the lynching and benefiting from it in his own sexual performance, his own self-concept of white man. And as Burton concludes this chapter on 148, in the symbolic universe of white man, Attica was much more than a prison rebellion. It was what James Baldwin called an upheaval in the universe, In response, state actors, white civil society, and mass media coalesced in a frenzied mob that inflicted world-shattering violence upon the bodies and minds, the very being of the rebels. Another, unfortunately, insufficient look at this book and this chapter. There's so much to get to. There's so much more. I hope in some ways this has been helpful. And I did just wanted to bring out a few points to try to connect some of the dots throughout these chapters, and at least from my own perspective, and particular set of interests and limited expertise. But I would be interested in more, and I am interested in much more discussion around what Burton is saying and how we interpret what Burton is saying in terms of not just what happened and the horrors described in this chapter, not just in terms of those horrors and what happened in that moment, but kind of as he's asking us, and as he talks about in the reference to Casper's work and letter, complicate how we understand time and space. That, as he says of Casper's letter, this is something that did happen, can happen, is happening, and beyond just those prison walls. All right, I look forward to some of the discussion. Keep on struggling, and I'll see you at the next one.